Let's get going. Welcome, everybody. I am Sophie Smith. I'm the Assistant Director of York Public Library, and I am so pleased to welcome you to our program this evening with Gerry Runte, who's going to tell us all about York's Climate Action Plan. This talk is the final installment of the climate series that the York Public Library and the York Climate Action Plan Steering Committee put together to explore all the different facets of the climate conversation. We were doing this in anticipation of the spring referendum, which when we started planning this in October or November seemed like a million years from now, and now is finally upon us in the coming weeks. We've heard from lobstermen, we've heard from scientists, we've heard from legislators from York and further afield. All of those programs are recorded and available on York Public Library's website if you'd like to review any of those programs you may have missed. Right. As you can see, we're recording tonight's event, and it will be on the website in the next day or two. By default, I have everybody muted, and I recommend that you keep that way. But once Gerry's ready for questions, please feel free to unmute and ask away. You're also welcome to use the chat feature to ask questions later on. Without further ado, let's get started. Gerry Runte serves as the chair of York's Climate Action Plan Steering Committee, as well as a member of both the Energy Steering Committee and the Planning Board. He also recently kicked off his campaign as a candidate for Maine State Legislator House District 146. His career has been in the electric utility industry as well as the clean energy sector, and he's channeled his professional experience and knowledge into a dedication to York. It's been a pleasure to work with Gerry to put this program series together, and I'm now pleased to turn it over to him to bring it home.
Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for coming out on a day like right now, which is such a contrast from the last several days. I was about to go out with the dog and then realized I've got to do this. And thanks to the library for this opportunity. What I thought I'd do is, and we've been doing this in a couple of different venues over the last month and a half, is to give a fairly high-level summary of what's in the Climate Action Plan. And for people who haven't, let me move this a little bit. For people who have not had the opportunity to go through the different versions of the document, on the Climate Action Plan webpage, which is yorkcap.net, you can see an area where you have the opportunity to download the full version of the plan, which is somewhere above 150 pages. Without the appendices, there's a couple hundred pages of appendices. There's a much more easily handled 19-page summary. And what you're going to see tonight mirrors closely to what that particular version states. So let me share screen here. Okay, so do people see? I see. Hold on. Okay, here we go. Do you see the Climate Action Plan banner? You don't. How about this? So give it a second, and that should be. All right, we're gonna switch gears here a sec. I really apologize for this. Now do we see it? Or do you just see me?
We see both.
All right. I'll try one more thing and see if this makes a difference. All right, I'm just going to work from the non-full page version here. Just make this bigger. Okay, so what exactly is the climate action plan? It's really quite simply a collection of recommendations. They're non-binding, and they're meant for consideration by not just the town leadership, the select board, or various town committees, but also by the community as a whole. And you'll see why that is. You'll see why that is in a minute. And then really it serves two purposes. First of all, we can see daily the impacts of climate change on the natural environment around us. We can see more frequent storm surges. We can see larger storm surges. We can see potential issues to infrastructure. We can see changing species in the Gulf of Maine. We can see changes to insect vectors, and we see changes to the amount of heating, the lower amount of the cooling, the warming of both the winter and the summer. Now we know why that is happening, which is because of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are going into the environment and how those emissions ultimately work their way through to cause these impacts. But so the plan wants to do two things. It wants to get the town and the community ready for the things that we know are going to come, and regardless of what happens in the way of reducing emissions, are still going to happen, unfortunately. But we all have an obligation to reduce our emissions to the maximum extent possible. And so the plan also provides recommendations that will assist us to do that. This document was an effort of quite a few number of people. It began with input from our two consulting firms, Civic Moxie and Climate Advisory, but then was modified, edited, got input from really 52 volunteers that had been organized into 6 working groups. And in addition to their involvement in pulling the plan together, we went out on a survey to the public. We had a couple of in-person public events where there was an opportunity for people to give input. So really, the final document was certainly the effort of both private citizens and knowledgeable experts, and tempered by input from the general public. Now, we started out with 6 working groups that looked at 6 specific topical areas. But once we assembled all of the recommendations and goals that came out of those working groups, what emerged was organizing them into really 8 categories: buildings, infrastructure, access to renewable energy, natural resources, mobility, waste and recycling, community resilience, and leadership and capacity. The 8 focus areas have 25 goals among them, which resulted in 152 actions that form the basis for the recommendations that I mentioned right at the beginning. And I'll go through the 25 goals. We're not going to go through the 152 actions, but you're welcome to go see them on the website, as I've mentioned. In terms of buildings, there's really, the focus on buildings is primarily, well, it goes to both emissions and infrastructure preparation. When we took inventory of the emissions from the community as a whole, round numbers, 3/4 of the greenhouse gas emissions in town come from buildings, and it comes from heating those buildings with oil and propane. So buildings as a target for greenhouse gas emissions, it's a major target. It's a major target. So there's a whole collection of actions that are meant to reduce emissions from existing buildings, but also to take another look in terms of the preparation part of this plan, to take a look at building codes that would provide a higher degree of resilience to flooding and temperature change for new and heavily renovated buildings. And also as part of the emissions recommendations, new building codes that are designed to reach net zero carbon emissions for new construction and buildings. And that's a target that's actually quite feasible today. And it's not just feasible, it's economic. And if someone takes a look at the long-term costs and savings involved, what small incremental additional costs there might be in building this way are more than offset by the longer term savings as the building operates. And then awareness of climate friendly building products, and there's a number that are already being made in Maine. In terms of infrastructure, this is a big one. Water, sewer, public safety, roads, healthcare, dams, they're all impacted by a combination of increasing sea level rise and higher frequency of higher levels of storm surge flooding when you have extreme weather events. One of the presentations several weeks back, Mike Sinclair from the Lobstermen Association was talking about the impacts of the warming of the Gulf of Maine and on fisheries and stuff. But he provided me a video that he took at a dock during the February storm. And if you recall, that was a fairly nasty storm, and it had a storm surge associated with it. The storm surge did not coincide with high tide. It was about 3 or 4 hours prior to high tide. But at the level it came in at, it completely overwhelmed a couple of docks in town, and had the high tide and the storm surge coincided, a couple of commercial docks would have had substantial damage. And this is the kind of thing that planning now needs to begin to protect the assets. And also, to the extent that you think about long-term adverse effects, where a neighborhood might get stranded because of a road, or you have a heat event and it impacts people's health and they need to be evacuated, there are recommendations that speak to installing and improving high quality broadband service in New York, both to minimize vehicle miles traveled, people working from home rather than commuting, but also to improve emergency services. In terms of access to renewable energy, actually, there's been quite a bit of effort developing from state initiatives. But nonetheless, there are options for individuals to essentially go their own way, not be part of community solar and some other things. And we want to make sure that people have access to renewable energy, and should they decide to do something on their own, that codes and standards that are existing now don't inadvertently discourage that. And so there's a number of action items or recommendations that talk about those elements. Natural resources is an extraordinarily important category. The wetlands and the estuary systems really provide two major functions. From a resiliency standpoint, they're a buffer zone for accommodating storm surges and sea level rise, but they're also a huge absorber of carbon. And frankly, the waterborne versions absorb several multiples of carbon relative to the forest that's up that abuts them. So they're very important, and therefore there are a number of recommendations that speak to conservation and protection of the systems that we do have, and if at all possible, wherever possible, to permanently conserve them. One of the things that the plan did not do was to do a detailed economic evaluation of what these natural resources provide. And once the plan begins implementation, the idea is, let's get this done so that we have not just this subjective statement of, they provide for resilience and they do carbon storage, but there's also a direct economic value to that. And with that number, it can really guide any kind of decision making with regard to conservation and protection. Mobility. The second largest area of greenhouse gas emissions in the community was transportation. And that's when you look at it from the standpoint of transportation within York, people coming into York, people maneuvering around York, people commuting from York. It does not include the emissions that we're also getting from the traffic on the turnpike. If you include that, the numbers become much, much larger. But there's plenty that we can do to reduce the emissions within our own control. Expanding electric vehicle use. For every electric vehicle you put on the road, for every gas-powered vehicle you exchange for an electric vehicle, you get an instant 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions relative to what that gas car would do for the same mileage and the same usage. There are things the municipal, we can have a green fleet policy for the motor pools in the municipal fleets, the police, the Department of Public Works, the town hall. And we can encourage, you can't tell people that you have to do this, but encourage the adoption of green fleet policies by the water and sewer districts and commercial fleets that do operate in York. There's recommendations that deal with a diversity of mobility options so that various populations that now would need to hop in a car to do something don't have to do that. Greater ability, greater walkability, greater opportunities for even bicycle use. A number of things to reduce this vehicle miles traveled, which is really the primary metric that the emissions really are calculated on. And then from a town standpoint, facilitate, promote, and track the installation of EVs and charging infrastructure in York, not just for residents and employees, but for visitors. And in fact, later on this year, there will be an ordinance, a draft ordinance presented that will be on the November ballot that has a number of provisions in it, such as if you're going to build workforce housing or if you're going to build multifamily housing in your parking lot, you need to have electric vehicle charging, a certain number of spots, depending on how large the building is. Waste and recycling. A bit of a surprise to some people. It's not a huge factor in greenhouse gas emissions, but it's an enormous factor in terms of the overall sustainability of the community. Reducing municipal solid waste is the principal action that can be taken. Our solid waste today goes to an incinerator, and you know what that means. But we can also ask that in the contracts that the town executes with waste removal and recycling, that the operations of those providers include sustainability and climate criteria in terms of how we decide which one to work with. Community resilience. There's the climate impacts that we see potentially happening don't happen necessarily on an equitable basis from across all communities. They have potentially a greater impact on sectors of the community that maybe have income disability, that have lower levels of income, and put them in a position where they can't afford to take steps that are necessary to cope with health and disaster risks, for example. They're not in a position to go out and buy an electric vehicle or even implement energy efficiency kinds of measures in their home. They can't afford to do that, despite the fact that doing that in a longer term sense would reduce their utility costs. So there's a set of actions and recommendations that begin to address these issues. And we also think that the town ought to lead by example and establish a business sustainability award or some form of recognition program. But this last category is the most critical, I think, in terms of the difference between this being a really interesting, nice plan that sits on coffee tables and in bookshelves, but that's where it stops. The plan needs to be implemented, and it needs an organization and leadership to be implemented. The dilemma here is that it's not easy to identify any single existing organization in town. A lot of it deals with things that are well beyond either the resources or even the jurisdiction of town government to do. So how do you get this plan out there and working as a living, breathing document that is guiding actions within the community and the government? So I'll talk about that in a moment, but really when you take the document as a whole, there's really four primary priorities. Tax base and property values are vulnerable to sea level rise and flooding. The infrastructure enhancements that are part of Goal 2.1 are really critical. Our transportation system is really prone to impacts from flooding. We need to protect those assets. In terms of public health and emergency preparedness, we believe that the response team, the coordination response team that was established to deal with COVID, that integrated town government, the hospital, county officials, the emergency preparedness folks, York YCSA, a number of different organizations all operated as a coordination committee to make sure that everyone understood what the other party was doing, that input was taken from a variety of different perspectives. And the model that was used there worked really well, we think, in terms of how the town continues to cope with COVID. That model looks like an excellent way, at a minimum, to deal with climate and health responses. But when we talk in a moment about implementation, it's also a model that could play a role in how we go about making this plan a successful initiative. And then finally, and as I mentioned earlier, natural resources is a major priority, and permanently conserving natural resources, the goals 4.1 to 4.3 are really important. But getting back to how this thing, well, the greenhouse gas emissions component of the plan, this repeats what I had said earlier, but it really focuses, number one, on reducing emissions from the building sector. And there's a number of goals that deal with that. And then number two is dealing with transportation. Those are our two big areas. But this is where we really need to focus a lot of effort once the ballot is over on May 21st. And I don't think it's being too optimistic to think that the plan is very likely to be approved for adoption. I think the question, hopefully the question is, by how large a margin? But it then begs the question, then what? And what the plan says is, the only way this thing is really going to become a successful initiative, where the recommendations and the action items begin to see some level of implementation, is that implementation of the climate action plan be put in the hands of some sort of an entity external to town government. And that entity would oversee the implementation of recommendations, coordinate the various stakeholders that are potentially involved. And in the plan, not all of these really need to be involved on a day-to-day basis, but there's a good 60 different partners, collaborators, groups, organizations that potentially could have a role in various parts of implementing the actions that are in the plan. Over time, the set of actions that have been outlined now were based on what we know now. That knowledge is going to change over time. And so over time, the goals and priorities are very likely to shift as new information becomes known. This the set of action items is a starting point for 2022, but it certainly may change in 3 to 5 years. Somebody's got to monitor success. How do you know whether it's working unless somebody is checking to see if in fact it really is? There's a huge component of public education in this plan. And the reason for it is simple. A lot of it relies on communicating to the public both the importance of the actions that need to be taken and how to go about taking them. So that's a big piece. And then finally, there are a number of elements here that there absolutely no way have any role in normal town budgets. But on the other hand, the plan identifies a whole number of different sources of external funding that, at least for the moment, are available now. But in order to go out and get that money, to get grants from various state and federal operations, you need people who know how to do it and have the time to put together grant applications, and then you need people to administer the grant, because 9 times out of 10, once you get money along these kinds of lines, there's reporting requirements and whatnot, so that whoever the benefactor was or the provider was can be assured that the money they gave was applied in a useful way. So, excuse me. Our recommendation for this is that as soon as the ballot is over, the select board convenes a committee with only one purpose. And the purpose is to identify and recommend what this public-private organization might be to implement the climate action plan, and to come back before the end of the year with that recommendation. And the kinds of things that would fit would be, for example, a private-public partnership along the lines of the COVID coordination committee that could be applied to the various, that would organize the various entities, the key entities that would implement the plan. You could go so far as what Portland and South Portland did. They formed a nonprofit, a public-private nonprofit that does those functions that would be done on an ad hoc basis in the model that the COVID coordination plan used, but in fact do it in the context of an actual corporate entity. And there's a number of different models that might work. The decision was made not to go that one step further and say, this is the model we think ought to be the right one. And in fact, the Climate Action Steering Committee, although it should have a voice in what this new entity might look like, the decision on what that should be needs to be done with a group whose expertise is beyond those of us who pulled the climate action plan together. So we recommended the possible membership of town planning department. They have an obvious role. Some subset, for example, of the Energy Steering Committee or the CAP Steering Committee. York Ready for Climate Action, they're solely focused on greenhouse gas emission reductions and clearly have a place at the table. York Land Trust in terms of methods and approaches to deal with a lot of the natural resource recommendations, especially those that talk about permanently protecting and conserving. SMPDC, it's an acronym for the Regional Planning Development Commission that has done an enormous amount of work in trying to coordinate seacoast towns from Kittery all the way up to Biddeford in terms of helping them assess what the impacts of sea level rise and storm surge might be, and provide for approaches to develop varying levels of community resilience. I can say that York as a community, because of the Climate Action Plan, is frankly way ahead of any of these other communities who are just now beginning this process of coming up with a vulnerability assessment and their own greenhouse gas emission inventories. But SMPDC can play a key role in regional guidance and regional coordination. YCSA could play a role in terms of making sure that there's that what gets done is equitable and reaches all the right communities. This is really the bottom line for the plan. We need to get we need to get on the table a specific recommendation on how the Climate Action Plan gets done, and do it as soon as possible, but absolutely by the end of the year, so that in the beginning of 2023, the effort begins to put in place the implementation entity for the Climate Action Plan. So that is, that's the plan in a nutshell, and glad to answer any questions. Let me get this out.
So we can let people unmute, but I do see one here in the chat asking who or what body will be accountable for the implementation of the plan, including measuring, reporting achievements and lack of achievements under the plan, which I think you got towards the end there, but I didn't know if you want to clarify further.
Yeah, I mean, let's take a hypothetical, and let's say that the model that was used for the COVID response is the public-private model that's used for Climate Action Plan implementation. That group will need to have its own staff, at least 2 people, maybe more, and those people would provide a number of functions, including going out and getting the funding necessary to pursue some of the actions, to fund themselves as well. I mean, you've seen what's happened when the town has gone for an environmental planner in the planning department, and the difficulties that come up with getting them approved through budgets. This public-private partnership will have to have an employee or 2 funded externally, I think, and that core group of people are going to be accountable for what John is asking here. The greenhouse gas emissions inventory needs to be redone on some regular basis, probably every 2 years at least. there's got to be some sort of regular reporting back to the community about going through the list of actions, which actions have begun some sort of implementation, which ones haven't, what's been the results in terms of what those actions are. So yes, I mean, this implementation entity, it's a god-awful term. I wish I had something better to use, but this is the organization that's going to be doing that work, or at least tasking others who are part of that group to go do this. So I'm looking at John's second question here about traffic on 95. When we look at the greenhouse gas emissions for transportation and the York Climate Action Plan, we look at it from the standpoint of what things are within the reasonable control of the town itself. And what that comes down to is providing ways in town planning that minimize or attempt to reduce vehicle use in general, whether it's combustion or electric. And to the extent that you've got vehicles, getting them electrified through various incentives. The only thing the town can do, I think, from a standpoint of the turnpike traffic element, is working as much as possible with initiatives at the state level and frankly at the federal level that are engineered to deal with the bigger question of large-scale transportation. You know, there's a scope at which the climate action plan for York, there was a need to keep the climate action plan for York something that was doable by York. It's not going to solve all the problems, obviously. And in the case of I-95 traffic, it's trying to have a voice in Augusta on those measures that are looking at transportation on a statewide basis. Conversion is not going to happen to EVs. I mean, I agree, it's not going to happen across all sectors. Not everyone can afford them, but that's also what the story is today. 5 years from now, what's an EV really going to cost? And if through a combination of availability and market factors, the prices could very easily come down and make them much more affordable. There's the other element too, and that is in terms of new vehicles, there's a number of major manufacturers who have begun to talk about specific dates by which they will no longer make conventional vehicles. So at some point, maybe it's 2035, you may not be able to easily go buy a gas-powered vehicle. But I mean, your point is well taken. We're not going to change out every heating unit in every house in York to a heat pump. Nor is every vehicle in town going to be converted to an electric vehicle. But the bottom line is those are the two biggest sources of our emissions. And so how do you take a bite out of that? Well, the recommendations begin to try to address that by convincing people that this is a good thing to do.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I own a house in the harbor that my family has had for many, many, many years, and now I mostly rent it out because I don't live in York year round. I really want to do my part to reduce the emissions, and I know and I want to come up. I'm going to be coming up next month and trying to put some changes in, like insulation or others, but I don't know anything about this, and I wondered if you knew who could give me good advice about how to retrofit or upgrade the house to reduce the emissions, and especially since it's oil heating and other things like that, because I don't really know who I can trust to give me disinterested advice.
Okay. Well, for the cheapest and quickest way to reduce emissions deals with increasing energy efficiency. Changing out the burner itself. Yep, it does have an impact, but that's not necessarily something that a lot of people are in the position to just do arbitrarily. They may want to wait until there's time, it's time for a new furnace. And instead of putting in the same thing again, putting in some sort of alternative. But back to the energy efficiency thing, and I'm not sure it's unique to Maine, but Maine has got a terrific organization called Efficiency Maine that is a quasi-government agency. They end up administering a lot of grants that come from legislation, but they function somewhat independently. And what's important about them is that you can go to the Efficiency Maine website and click on the section that talks about homeowners. And what you will find there is a huge set of resources. They have a list of, first step, by the way, first step in what you're talking about is to have a reasonable energy audit done on the building itself. Someone comes in, takes an assessment of what the most feasible things are that can be done to improve the energy efficiency of a building. And they have a list of approved contractors to go do that. And they have a rebate program that can pay for a substantial amount of that energy audit. And then depending on what that energy audit recommends, which could be insulation, it could be weather sealing, it could be it's time for a new oil burner, for example. There's a number of programs that Efficiency Maine has where there are rebates to support a lot of these actions. So it's kind of a one-stop stop where you can get credible information, number one, about who can go do the work, as well as resources where you can really mitigate the costs through access to programs that can provide funding. It's efficiencymaine.org is the website.
Thank you so much for that. I'll definitely check that out, and thank you to John for the link that you sent in the chat.
I want to mention quickly too, the library is in the midst of putting together some additional programming on topics like this in the near future. We're sort of trying to figure out the best way to get the word out and the information out to people. And while it probably won't be happening in the next month, unfortunately, just because, again, getting people around for programs is hard this time of year, I do anticipate that in the next 6 months, we'll have some programming specifically on the steps and the processes and the people to talk to kind of make these changes happen for the whole community.
I have a question. Lorraine, can you
Yes,
hear me? Okay.
yes.
I have a comment for George and a question for you. George, years back, we did use Efficiency Maine for our audit. And at the time, the audit was completely free. And then we got a loan from them to have the changes made in the house. And at the time, the loan was 0% interest. So be sure to go to them first. And then, Gerry,
Yeah.
my question is, it seemed like some of the things that you mentioned were duplications under the comprehensive plan. I've been to a couple of their meetings, and I was just wondering if your committee and the comprehensive plan people spoke to each other. For example, I was thinking about the mobility stuff.
And my apologies, I should have mentioned that early on, and maybe not everyone's aware of this, but around the same time as we were developing the climate action plan, the update to the comprehensive plan was ongoing and continues to be ongoing. They're just about ready to produce their first major draft. It gets presented, well, actually it gets presented tomorrow night at the ComFest 2. Yeah, there are several areas of overlap between the climate action plan and the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan takes up on, for example, it includes some of the ordinance recommendations on transportation.
Right.
It includes some of the ordinance recommendations on energy efficient building. It takes to heart issues such as proper design for adapting to sea level rise. It addresses really a number of issues, natural resource protection. And the way the two plans worked was, first of all, the vulnerability assessment that was done for the climate action plan, as well as the greenhouse gas inventory, both informed it's the same consultants, by the way. All that work was used to develop the specific recommendations in the comprehensive plan. Where the two plans differ is the climate action plan recommends a specific action. What the comprehensive plan is meant to do is essentially provide a vision for the community over time, such that if the community decides to do something, it is then evaluated in the context of this vision, and does it fit in the comprehensive plan view of the world or not? And if not, it's not going to happen. So the comprehensive plan establishes a context for some of the action items that might come out of the climate action plan that require any sort of municipal action. So if the climate action plan said, do X, Y, Z about buildings, for example, in order for that to happen, it would have to be viewed as in the context of what the comprehensive plan view of the world ought to be. And if it fits, then you can do it. So there's overlap of the two plans, but they have different purposes. And one informed the other.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a little long answer there. I think I could be a little more concise, but that's the story. There's a couple of things I should also mention. There's a climate scientist, Catherine Hayhoe. She just produced a book, published a book about communicating climate issues, especially to audiences that aren't receptive. And she's got a number of different recommendations, but she said the most important thing that people can do, more important than weatherizing your house, or more important than buying an electric vehicle, is to talk about this. Talk about it to neighbors, talk about it to other friends, talk about it to other people. The more awareness and the understanding that exists, the more likely there'll be better understanding of what needs to be done, and maybe a more conducive environment to taking the steps that are necessary to achieve some of these goals. If you well, I've lost my chain of thought for a moment there. Let's move on for a second. Any other questions? Well, good. I hope this this was useful to everyone to get a little better picture of what this not quite a year effort has done, and hopefully you're all there to support adoption of the plan by the town, although I can't say that from the standpoint of the Climate Action Plan Steering Committee, but as me, just good old Gerry Runte, I can say, please vote yes on Article 70. The more of a mandate that we have, the less ability there would be for elements within town to push back against some of these recommendations as they evolve into real action.
Thank you so much, Gerry, for this presentation. And I think this is also very much a continuing conversation, even after the support, the town gets the support of the voters on this issue. Hopefully, there's still a lot of topics and ideas to discuss and keep learning about. So I encourage anybody who's interested in making recommendations on additional programming on this topic to reach out to me at the library, because we certainly want to keep this conversation flowing and active in York, where it's really, it's been a pleasure to put this together over the past few months with Gerry and everyone else. Thank you so much for making this happen, Gerry. This whole series was your brainchild, and it's been great.
Well, I gotta say, I mean, as much work as it has been to get it to this stage and get it into a codified document that articulates a set of recommendations, getting those recommendations implemented, getting actions on them, this is a multi-year effort. It's an enormous effort. It taps a whole variety of different elements of the community. And boy, if anybody wants to get personally involved, there's going to be opportunities right and left.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and have a good night, everyone.
Thanks.